Hey everyone, this is Cryptic or Kobe, whatever you want to call me here. Before we get into this video, I just want to talk about a couple of things that are going on with this video specifically, and some other things, but mostly this video. This video has been one of the most frustrating things I have probably ever worked on, and what makes it all the more worse is that it's mostly my fault. Um, I don't know what happened um when I was recording this video, but for some reason the audio and the video were completely unsynced and the video would just completely freeze in some places. And why I say this is mostly my fault is that I had recorded this video nearly 2 months ago and I had procrastinated working on it for about exactly 2 months as well. Well, probably about a month and a half. Um, in the time between me recording it and me editing it, there was probably a month and a half of time, and then I figured out the video was messed up. So that one is definitely on me. This video was meant to be out in early July, and obviously now we're creeping up towards the beginning of September. Um, End of August, beginning of September. So how long it's taken is totally on me. I don't know why, but as soon as I got this video recorded, my entire interest for this video completely died off. I'm not sure why. This is something that's happened in the past before. It's just something that happens with me sometimes. I'm not sure why. It's very annoying. It's very frustrating. But at this point, I have considered completely scrapping this video and just being completely done with it and just never coming back to it. But instead, what I'm going to do is just upload this as an audio only thing, because I just really don't want to deal with this anymore. I don't want to re-record it. If I genuinely sat down and decided to re-record it, it would never get done. I know it wouldn't. So I'm just going to release it as an audio only thing. And speaking of that, the audio only thing, I'm going to start making a bit more of an effort to upload my videos as podcasts both on YouTube and on Spotify. I'm also looking into how to distribute the podcast versions to different things like Apple Music and Amazon Music and stuff like that. So that's coming in the future. The other thing is that if you've kind of been following around or you follow me here, you'll notice that I've changed around the look on my channel. Um, the logo, which you can probably see on the screen right now. Um, this is going to be the new logo going forward for the moment. Maybe down the line I'll change it again. More than likely down the line I will change it again. The old photo that I had on here, like the hoodie, the pumpkin head with the hoodie, that I made a few years ago, and I used made very loosely because it was an AI generated image. And a few years ago, I made it when that whole AI thing really started to take off. And obviously now I know there's a lot more problems with AI, and I'm just frankly sick of looking at it because I know it's AI. So now it's just an illustration I made on Canva for free, and I like it. It still represents my channel, I think, pretty good. I like the style of it. And I'm glad to get away from the AI thing. Uh, so yeah, new look for the channel. It, like I said, it'll probably change down the line. Maybe I'll find an artist to make me a new non-AI generated image down the line. But for now, we're just going to stick with this. I think it's still, like I said, I think it's very representative. I want to apologize again for how long this video has taken and what problems it has. And if you don't want to watch it because it doesn't have video, I completely understand, but I'm not going to let all of the time and effort I put into this just go to waste. But I don't want to put any more time and effort into it, if I'm being honest, because if I drag this on any longer, it's going to actually drive me insane to the point that I just don't even want to mess with it anymore. So yeah, thank you all for the support. Thank you all for being understanding. Thank you all so much for watching. And as always, I hope to see you all again soon. On this channel, I like to talk about things that I'm interested in. Things like history, automotive, and the supernatural, all of which are things that I've made videos on. But there is another major topic that I am fascinated by, which is video games. Born in 2000, I grew up surrounded by the first, second, and third generations of the Xbox and PlayStation consoles. Through them, and obviously the newer consoles, I've experienced some of my personal favorite stories and characters in all of media. Games like Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption, Overwatch, Call of Duty, God of War, and Cyberpunk, just to name a few, make up and made up so much of my childhood and current day interests. And while I could talk about how some of these games have severely degraded over the years and how the companies behind consoles are trying their best to ruin everything, that is not the point of this video. Instead, I want to talk about one game, or more specifically, a series that is my personal favorite of all time: Assassin's Creed. Now, I still remember renting the original Assassin's Creed from my Xbox 360 back in the day. Little did I know back then that that one rental would spawn a nearly 2 decade long obsession. I have played every single game this series has to offer, and I pretty much love them all. Even these ones, despite their faults, have aspects I still love because they simply exist in the Assassin's Creed universe. I think what makes it so special for me is that it is historical fiction. Key moments take place in real historical locations with real historical figures. And I, already interested in history, love being able to like see these locations and these characters in a way that lets me sort of directly interact with them. As I said, over the last 2 decades, it has become an obsession. And as of last month, I literally have a tattoo on my arm here as a testament to my love for this series. Now, among the multiple games in the series, there is one specifically I want to talk about today. And if you're familiar with the series and saw what this video was about, you likely already know I'm going to be talking about Assassin's Creed Black Flag. For those who don't know, Assassin's Creed Black Flag follows the story of Edward Kenway, who is a fictional pirate who prowls the Caribbean during the golden age of piracy. Originally released in 2013, Black Flag is undoubtedly one of the most popular games of the series, but as of recording this video, a remake of the game titled Black Flag Resynced was released just a little bit over a week ago. Safe to say, I was very excited to play it and have pretty much been playing nothing but it since it came out, and I absolutely love it. But through that excitement and how much fun I've been having with it, I decided to make this video. You see, a couple of years ago, I made a video covering the life of the world's most notorious pirate, Blackbeard. In that video, I mentioned that the first time I'd ever heard of Blackbeard was through Black Flag. I'm going to be honest, it's probably the reason I'm as interested in pirates. It's probably the reason I'm as interested in pirates as I am today. I think I said that right. I might have been having a stroke. I'm not. But in the game, Blackbeard is a recurring character who has some of the best scenes throughout the entire game. But he is just one of the many historical pirates who show up throughout the game. But he's not even the first one you meet. Instead, that honor goes to a man named Stede Bonnet. Stede Bonnet, or the Gentleman Pirate as he was called, was a real life pirate during the golden age of piracy. Earning his nickname from a wealthy upbringing, Bonnet abandoned his successful plantation in Barbados to become a pirate. Now, despite his unorthodox origins, Bonnet would become a semi successful pirate and even collaborated with Blackbeard for a time. Now, throughout the game of Black Flag, Bonnet is seen as jolly, adventurous, carefree, and naive. All of these traits make his successes and alliance with Blackbeard seem very unlikely. But how exactly does the game's version of Bonnet compare to his real life counterpart? Well, that's exactly what I wanted to find out. So, as a celebration of Black Flag Resync, I decided to take a deep dive into the real life of Stede Bonnet and make it into a video for all of you. And before we get into it, I do want to thank you for clicking on the video in the first place, and I hope you enjoy. But with that being said, let's take a look at the life of the gentleman pirate Major Stede Bonnet. Born in Barbados during the summer of 1688, Stede Bonnet was the son of Edward and Sarah Bonnet. By the time of his birth, Stede's family was among the wealthiest on the entire island. This was because of Thomas Bonnet, who was Stede's grandfather, being one of the earliest Englishmen to settle in the colony. And during his time, Thomas would establish a 400-acre sugar plantation just south of the Barbadian capital of Bridgetown. When Thomas passed away in 1676, Edward inherited the estate and managed it until his own death in 1694. After Edward's passing, Sarah took over the estate for a few months before she also passed away. The estate then went to Stede, but since the newly orphaned Stede Bonnet was only 6 years old, he was obviously in no position to manage a plantation. So during his formative years, Stede was raised by his maternal grandparents, who also oversaw the property until he was old enough to take care of it himself. Now, seeing as he was the heir to one of the largest plantations in the colony, Stede's early life was one of privilege and wealth. He was said to have received a good education and was taught how to be a gentleman of the time. He was also waited on day and night by servants and slaves while learning the ins and outs of running the plantation. Then in 1708, the 20-year-old Bonnet took full control of the estate. The following year, on November 21st, 1709, Bonnet married Mary Allenby. Mary, who was 16 at the time, was the daughter of William Allenby, who was another one of Barbados's wealthiest plantation owner. Also, somewhere around the time of this marriage, Bonnet had achieved the rank of major in the Barbadian military. Now, the reason I said somewhere instead of giving a more precise time is because nearly every source varies on when Bonnet actually achieved this rank. Similarly, the extent of Bonnet's military experience is also heavily debated. This seems to be because at the time in Barbados, members of the island's elite were simply given military titles without actually serving. Now, whether or not he served or didn't, um, Bonnet was said to be quite fond of his title, and it would become one of his most defining characteristics. Even today, if you research the man, you'll find that most sources label him as Major Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate. As for Stede's personal life, things seem to be going relatively well for him and Mary. By 1716, they'd had three sons named Allenby, Edward, and Stede Jr. Um, Tragically, however, Allenby, who was their firstborn, died sometime in 1715. Then, in January 1716, Bonnet was named Barbados's Justice of the Peace. However, by the end of 1716, Bonnet's friends began to notice a shift in his personality and believed he was suffering from a quote, disorder in his mind. What exactly this perceived disorder is and what caused it is unknown. Some say he was suffering from depression or insanity, while others speculate his decline was caused by the trauma of being orphaned at such a young age. Also, some sources claimed that Bonnet had particular discomforts in his married life. Again, what those discomforts were is unknown, but many theorize that the loss of Allenby may have left an irreparable rift between Stede and Mary. The theories go on, and the reason I've made such a point to go over some of them is so that you understand how absurd it is that Bonnet decided the best way to cope with his issues, whatever his issues may be. He decided the best way to cope with them was to become a pirate. Obviously, whatever mental duress Bonnet was under had led him to make such a drastic change in his life, but many still wonder why Bonnet chose to be a pirate specifically. And you got to do a lot of guesswork in a story like this because, the issue covering the story about someone from 3 centuries ago is that there's going to be a lot of varying information and it's just Sometimes it's very confusing. Now, in my guesswork, I do believe there is something about Bonnet that could explain this abrupt pivot to piracy, and that is the fact that Bonnet was known to have been a very avid reader, and by late 1716, many captains and sailors had published books recounting their adventures. Also, since the world was well into the second half of the golden age of piracy, there were so many stories available of buccaneers, privateers, and pirates. But even without these books, Bonnet still would have been well aware of piracy and its effects since he lived in Barbados. Being an island of the Caribbean during the aforementioned golden age of piracy, Barbados was frequently attacked by pirates who targeted ships coming to and from the colony. And through the tales of piracy told near his home and the adventures he'd read in his books, it's possible that he could have saw a sort of freedom. And it'd be a life completely at odds with his own, but maybe that's exactly what he wanted. Whatever the case, if Bonnet were to pursue his new dream, he would need a ship and crew of his own. Again, a little guesswork is needed to explain how Bonnet came across his preferred vessel. So, sometime between late 1716 and early 1717, Bonnet came to own a 60-ton sloop named the Revenge. Now, some sources say Bonnet outright purchased the ship from a merchant who happened to be docking in Bridgeport, while others say he commissioned a local shipyard to build the vessel. Either way, whichever one of these is true, the method Bonnet used immediately showed he was unlike any other pirate. Now, most pirate ships were either gained through hijacking, or they were seized, or they were just privateer vessels that had been refashioned. The Revenge, on the other hand, was purchased in some sort of way. This is something that is almost entirely unique to Bonnet, and as we'll see throughout the rest of this video, it was an early sign that he likely had no idea what he was doing. But after acquiring the Revenge, Bonnet had 10 cannons installed and began stocking the vessel with food, ammunition, water, and other seafaring essentials. Also, once again, something that points to his avid habit of reading, Bonnet had commissioned a small library to be built into the captain's quarters. Altogether, it's estimated that the purchase of the vessel and the modifications made costed somewhere around $500,000 today, and all of this was paid for directly by Bonnet. How many, if any, knew about Bonnet's newfound pursuit of piracy is unknown, but it is very likely that he was very secretive about the whole thing. As mentioned earlier, Barbados was no stranger to pirate activity, and by this time, pirates were deemed an a quote enemy of all mankind, and empires such as the British and Spanish were doing about everything in their power to suppress piracy in the Atlantic and Caribbean. And while in hindsight we can obviously see that Bonnet was arming his vessel for piracy, he had a pretty good alibi for the time. Because in Barbados, it wasn't uncommon for the island's elite to have personal vessels for leisure. But now that he had a proper ship, now he had to go about finding a proper crew. Similar to his acquisition of the Revenge, the way Bonnet formed his crew was also very unorthodox. Firstly, if I ask you to imagine a pirate, you would likely envision a skinny, dirty, and ragged type of man. And really, that image isn't too far off from the looks of most pirate captains and crew members. But then imagine you're one of these disheveled men when all of a sudden you're approached by a man dressed like royalty, wearing a large gold trimmed hat and a powdered wig, who asks if you'd like to join his pirate crew. Well, that exact scenario is how Bonnet went about organizing a crew. By 1717, the end of Queen Anne's War and the War of Spanish Succession had left many privateers and sailors of the Caribbean unemployed. And just as a quick explanation, if you don't know, A privateer is essentially a legally operating pirate. A privateer could receive something called a mark from a particular country, which gave them legality to attack and plunder ships of opposing nations during wartime. In the simplest terms, they're kind of like what people now call mercenaries. Now, many of these men that were unemployed and just kind of hanging around the Caribbean, they would be desperate for work, but that doesn't mean that they were stupid. I do believe that nearly every man Bonnet approached could immediately tell he had no experience and was certainly no pirate. Now, it is possible Bonnet knew this was how he'd be viewed because he'd offer any man who'd join his crew a salary. Now, this is yet another aspect of Bonnet that is essentially unique to him because it was customary for pirate crews to split up any plunder they gained. It could be that this was meant as an incentive or as a security measure, possibly both, that was used by Bonnet to entice these men to join his crew. Or, in an equally likely scenario, he may have had no idea how a pirate ship was usually run. Either way, Bonnet quickly amassed a crew of around 70 to 100 men. Then, in March 1717, Bonnet signed away his estate, his plantation, and all of his remaining business affairs to Mary and two of his friends. A couple of months later, in May 1717, the Revenge quietly departed from Bridgeport under the cover of night. In the days leading up to his departure, Bonnet told his friends and family that he'd be leaving for a trading voyage soon, but would be back home very soon. In reality, Bonnet left Barbados, his home, and family, including a newborn daughter, behind and would never return. From Barbados, Bonnet ordered his men to set sail for the Virginia Capes. Also, because this will be important later, before they set sail, Bonnet had requested that his men refer to him as Captain Edwards before they set sail to hide his identity. So, for the next few weeks, the Revenge quickly made its way through the Caribbean and sailed up the East Coast before arriving in Chesapeake Bay in mid June 1717. Now, despite Bonnet's inexperience, the Revenge was quite successful in its maiden voyage. Throughout the remainder of June into mid July 1717, the Revenge captured and plundered at least 4 vessels near the bay. However, one of the ships, named the Turbet, was given special treatment. You see, the Turbet was a Barbadian ship, and Bonnet, wanting to keep news of his turn to piracy a secret from his home island, ordered the ship to sail into an inlet, forced the crew off the vessel, and then burned it. After this, the Revenge sailed north to New York City, where it would capture 2 more ships. And it was around this time that, despite his best efforts to disguise himself, Bonnet was identified by British naval authorities. Then, around mid August, after resupplying and releasing any remaining captives on Gardiner's Island, the Revenge set sail for Charleston, South Carolina. By 1717, Charleston was the capital of the province of South Carolina. Also, the colony was still relatively young and had only separated from its northern counterpart in 1712. Because of its age, the colony was deemed a proprietary colony. Unlike a royal colony like Virginia, proprietary colonies, while still part of the British Empire, were not directly ruled by the King of England. Instead, the king would sell the lands to proprietors who would then oversee the colony themselves. By the time the Revenge arrived in late August 1717, South Carolina was in a pretty rough spot. Firstly, Charleston was the only noteworthy city in the entire colony. This was due to it being the only walled city and a coastal town with easy access to the Atlantic Ocean. Secondly, in the years leading up to 1717, South Carolina had faced many financial issues and was consistently at odds with the native population. All of this was exacerbated by a hurricane in 1713 that killed numerous people and destroyed a large portion of the Charleston port and its ships. However, the men aboard the Revenge didn't care about any hardships the colony was experiencing. So, after her arrival, the Revenge positioned itself just outside the harbor and waited. Soon after, the pirates aboard spotted a brigantine heading towards the city. The men raised their black flag, signaling their intentions. Immediately, the Bostonian vessel surrendered without a fight. On board, Bonnet found very few valuables, but did keep the ship hostage to prevent it from sailing into Charleston and alerting the city to the Revenge's presence. A day or two later, Bonnet spotted a sloop sailing towards them, and again, without a fight, the ship surrendered and was boarded by the pirates. But unlike the former, this ship was actually full of food, sugar, rum, and slaves. Now, unluckily for Bonnet, though, this was yet another Barbadian ship, and nearly every member of her crew immediately recognized him. Following the capture of the two vessels, Bonnet sailed them and the Revenge north to Cape Fear River in North Carolina. Once there, he removed the cargo from both vessels. Then he had the Barbadian sloop stripped for parts to repair the Revenge. Similar to his action in Virginia, he then torched the ship. After that, he forced the crew of the burned ship aboard the brigantine and then released them. But most of the brig's sails and rigging had also been stripped, which meant it took them nearly a month to sail the ship from Cape Fear back to Charleston. But upon their arrival in late September, the crew informed the Carolina governor, Robert Johnson, of their experience with Stede Bonnet. As for Bonnet and the Revenge, after leaving Charleston, nobody aboard really knew what to do next. In the first sign of dissent by the men aboard the Revenge, many of them became angry at Bonnet because he showed no leadership and often left any decisions up to his quartermaster or navigator. Eventually, however, a decision was made because the Revenge set sail for the pirate haven of Nassau sometime in early September 1717. A week later, the Revenge was somewhere between Florida and Cuba when a lookout spotted what he believed to be a very large Spanish merchant vessel. Bonnet, likely encouraged by the Revenge's previous successes, decided he wanted to take on the larger vessel. So his men readied the cannons, raised a black flag, and sailed towards it. But unlike most ships they'd encountered so far, this ship did not immediately surrender. Instead, just as the Revenge got close, the large vessel let loose a huge barrage of cannon fire. In reality, the ship Bonnet had just attacked was a Spanish man of war, which is a massive warship that was likely patrolling those waters at the time, looking for any remnants of a pair of Spanish wrecks that had sunk there a few years prior. In an instant, that first barrage of fire had killed and wounded over half of the Revenge's crew. Bonnet was among those who were severely injured as well. Somehow, though, the Revenge itself had not been completely disabled, and the remaining men were able to sail her away and outrun the warship. Bonnet's men would then thereafter patch him up, but he would spend the rest of the trip recovering in the captain's quarters. Finally, when the Revenge arrived in Nassau in mid September, Bonnet would come face to face with Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Now, since the man hardly needs an introduction and I've already dedicated an entire video to him, I won't go in depth on Blackbeard's backstory. However, if you somehow have no idea who Blackbeard is and are interested in hearing about the life of the most notorious pirate in history, I will leave a link to my video about him down in the description. For this video, though, since our main focus is on Bonnet, I'm going to try to talk about Blackbeard sort of through Bonnet's perspective, if that makes sense. So, when Bonnet first met Edward Teach, Teach was still the second in command to an English pirate named Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold had helped to establish the Republic of Pirates in Nassau, and by the time Bonnet met him and Teach, Hornigold's 30-gun sloop, the Ranger, was the most heavily armed ship in the Caribbean. Teach, on the other hand, was stuck sailing a small 6-gun vessel. But upon the Revenge's arrival, Teach saw an opportunity. The Revenge, while heavily damaged, could be repaired, and it was a better, more powerful ship than Teach's. So Teach, possibly with the help of Hornigold, convinced Bonnet to let Teach take control of the ship. Bonnet would still be permitted to stay in the captain's quarters and recover from his injuries, but he would no longer be the Revenge's captain. What Bonnet truly felt about this change is unknown, but it doesn't really seem as if it offended or angered him. It could be that he relinquished the Revenge so quickly because he saw that he wasn't cut out for this life. His crew, or, what was left of it, likely felt the same, considering they'd already grown frustrated with Bonnet over his inexperience and indecisiveness. So, with Teach now in charge, the Revenge was quickly repaired and was upgraded from 10 guns to 12. Teach also added more men to the crew, bringing the total to an estimated 150 aboard the sloop. With the Revenge repaired, upgraded, and resupplied, Hornigold and Teach, with Bonnet in tow, set sail for Virginia. And from late September to mid November, the pirate fleet captured and plundered at least 10 vessels from North Carolina all the way to New York. One of the ships captured was another 6-gun sloop, which was also added to the fleet. Now, when men aboard the plundered vessels reported their attacks at the hands of the pirates, most focused on Teach, who was quickly gaining notoriety, but some also noted the odd presence of Stede Bonnet. In at least a couple of reports, sailors claimed that Bonnet could be seen wandering around the Revenge in, quote, his morning gown, or could be found reading in his, quote, good library on board. Also, many of these reports noted that Bonnet was still quite injured from his run in with the Spanish man of war. Then, sometime in mid November, Hornigold was removed as captain for his reluctance to attack British ships. Following his removal, Hornigold claimed that he would soon retire from piracy and broke off from the rest of them. And when he left, he took the Ranger and one of the smaller sloops in the fleet. Afterward, Teach sailed the Revenge and the accompanying sloop back down to the Caribbean, and on November 28th, 1717, Teach spotted a very lucrative prize. It was a French slave frigate named La Concorde. Just as he saw in the Revenge, Teach saw opportunity in this vessel. But La Concorde was much larger than the two ships he commanded. But he decided the risk was worth it. And as luck would have it, La Concorde was actually in no condition to fight, because many aboard the ship were suffering from either scurvy or dysentery, and they promptly surrendered without a fight. After her capture, Teach sailed La Concorde to Bequia, where he renamed her the Queen Anne's Revenge. The ship, which was already armed with 16 cannons, was further weaponized by adding the 6 cannons from the small sloop they had captured a couple months earlier. Once the modifications were complete, the original crew and slaves of La Concorde were forced aboard the now weaponless sloop and sent away. Teach, now with a new flagship, returned the Revenge to Bonnet, who had mostly recovered from his injuries by December 1717. Now, following his reinstatement as captain, Bonnet decided he would accompany Teach and the Queen Anne's Revenge for a little while. From December 1717 to February 1718, Teach and Bonnet hunted ships all around the smaller Caribbean islands. Also, it was during these months that Teach finally fully committed to his Blackbeard persona. Then, in mid February, 2 Royal Navy vessels arrived in the Caribbean, specifically looking for Teach and Bonnet. But the pair, who were possibly aware that their recent activities had alerted Britain, had already fled to Honduras. Interestingly, though, after fleeing to Central America, Bonnet and Blackbeard separated for unknown reasons. And while Blackbeard spent much of March 1718 in Central America repairing the Queen Anne's Revenge, Bonnet actually sailed back into the Gulf of Mexico to resume hunting. Then, on the evening of March 28th, 1717, while prowling the Bay of Honduras, Bonnet spotted the Protestant Caesar, which was a massive merchant vessel from Boston. Again, Similar to his overconfidence he displayed during the run in with the Spanish man of war, Bonnet believed the Protestant Caesar, which I will tell you was 4 times the size of the Revenge and had twice as many cannons, was worth the risk. So the crew raised the black flag and fired some warning shots. The Protestant Caesar responded with some fire back of their own, and after this, Bonnet called out to the crew of the opposing vessel and threatened that if they fired another cannon, they, quote, would give them no quarter, which basically meant they would show them no mercy. In response, the Protestant Caesar fired on the Revenge again, and what transpired next was a 3-hour battle with the Protestant Caesar successfully fending off the pirates, because around midnight, the Revenge was forced to retreat. At this point, the men who chose to remain with Bonnet understandably grew tired of him. This was now the second time his arrogance and inexperience had needlessly put the Revenge and the crew in danger. This growing disdain was only further amplified when Bonnet was once again unable to decide what to do next. Eventually, though, the crew voted to sail to the Turnef Atoll off the coast of Belize. When they arrived a few days later, everyone, including Bonnet, was surprised to see Teach and the Queen Anne's Revenge anchored there as well. And immediately, as soon as they docked, numerous members of the Revenge deserted Bonnet and approached Blackbeard in hopes of joining his crew. And instead, Blackbeard once again saw an opportunity, but he no longer saw an opportunity in Bonnet. So, during a meeting with the Revenge's crew, Blackbeard suggested that Bonnet should step down as captain. And when it was put to a vote, the crew agreed with Blackbeard, and Bonnet was once again removed as captain. But Bonnet was not entirely removed from the fleet. Instead, Blackbeard came to him and, possibly to keep Bonnet from feeling sour about the decision, told him that since he had no experience running a pirate crew, he might instead prefer to live comfortably as a passenger aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. After Bonnet's removal, Blackbeard placed a man named Richards as the Revenge's new captain. And it was around this time Bonnet confided in a few loyal members of his crew that he was keen to retire from piracy. But feeling he would never be welcome in an English colony ever again, Bonnet said that he would flee to Spain or Portugal if, quote, he could only find a way to do so. Then, on April 5th, 1718, a Jamaican sloop named the Adventure sailed close to the atoll. David Harriet, who was the captain of the Adventure, mistakenly believed the Queen Anne's Revenge was the Protestant Caesar. However, as the Adventure sailed closer, Harriet realized his mistake and quickly tried to flee. But unluckily for him, the pirates had already spotted them, and just as the Adventure was turning, the Queen Anne's Revenge fired a few warning shots. I should also mention that in the very brief time Bonnet and Blackbeard were separated, Blackbeard had very rapidly upgraded his flagship. The number of cannons on board had increased from 22 to 40, and it was estimated that Blackbeard commanded about 250 men aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge alone. After the warning shot, the Revenge, which, like I said, was now captained by Richards, raised its black flag and pursued the Adventure. Once the vessels were alongside one another, Richards ordered Harriet to come aboard the Revenge, while 5 pirates would go aboard the Adventure and sail it back towards the Queen Anne's Revenge. When they returned, Blackbeard decided that he wanted to add the Adventure to his fleet, and he also offered to let Harriet and his crew join there. He offered to let Harriet and his crew join Blackbeard's crew, and that was an offer which they all accepted. But that doesn't mean Harriet would remain as the Adventure's captain. Instead, Blackbeard's quartermaster, Israel Hands, would be instated as her new captain. Over the following days, 3 additional vessels would be captured and added to the fleet. And by the time the pirates left the atoll on April 8th, 1718, Blackbeard controlled 6 ships and over 400 men. And with his newly formed armada, Blackbeard had only one goal in mind, which was to burn the Protestant Caesar. When members of the Revenge's crew had told Blackbeard about the encounter with the vessel, Blackbeard made it his sole objective to see the ship destroyed. Now, according to crew members who later would testify against him, Blackbeard wanted to burn the ship so the crew would, quote, not brag when they went to New England that they had beaten a pirate. So, on the morning of April 9th, 1718, while stalking the Bay of Honduras, a member of Blackbeard's crew spotted their target. Aboard the Protestant Caesar, William Weir, who was the vessel's captain, was very alarmed to see a pirate fleet rapidly approaching with both black and red flags raised. Which, just as a quick thing, the black flag means that whoever's attacking you is a pirate. The red flags were basically the no quarter flag, which means they were going to kill you if they came on board. So, as the pirate ships came closer, Captain Weir recognized both the Queen Anne's Revenge and the Revenge. Rightly believing Blackbeard was seeking payback for the Revenge's loss a few weeks earlier, the crew of the Protestant Caesar, including Weir, fled to the shore in the ship's boats, fearing they would be, quote, murdered by the sloop's company if the pirates captured them. Also, after that March run in with the Revenge, 4 sloops were assigned to accompany the Protestant Caesar, but just like Weir and his men, every member aboard those sloops also fled to shore. For the next 2 days, the pirates would strip the Protestant Caesar and the sloops of all their valuables, and as they were finishing up on April 11th, Blackbeard sent a member of his crew ashore to find and deliver a message to Captain Weir, basically asking him to come aboard and assuring him that if he did come aboard, he would not be harmed. Shocking, I don't know why, but for some reason he accepted this offer. And when he arrived, Blackbeard told Weir that he was happy that he and his men had abandoned their ship because if they hadn't, members of the Revenge likely would have killed everyone aboard. Blackbeard also told Weir that while he and his men would be spared, he was still planning to burn the Protestant Caesar as comeuppance for their battle with the Revenge a few weeks earlier. And the following day, April 12th, Blackbeard and his men, as promised, set fire to the Protestant Caesar, as well as one of the sloops that had been accompanying her. Afterward, Weir and his men were placed aboard one of the 3 remaining sloops, all of which the pirates soon released, essentially unharmed. As for Blackbeard and his fleet, they would spend the next month traveling north through the Caribbean and up the east coast of the US. And during those travels, the pirates are estimated to have plundered 20 additional ships. Then, in May 1718, Blackbeard arrived off the coast of Charleston, which would soon become the site of his boldest endeavor. Now, before we dive into the Charleston Blockade, I do want to mention that after Bonnet's second removal from command, he all but disappears from history for a while. Obviously, we know that he was on the Queen Anne's Revenge, but that's truly the extent of what is known about his involvement. And while I've tried to keep this video more focused on the events Bonnet was actively involved in, I've found it kind of hard to gloss over some events he just happened to be present for. And one of those events is Blackbeard's blockade of Charleston. Now, because this event is far more linked to Blackbeard than Bonnet, I have opted to condense some of the information about it for brevity. But if you are interested in a more in-depth description of the blockade, I would once again recommend you watch my video on Blackbeard, which goes far more into detail than I will here. But with that said, let's talk about the blockade. So, throughout the month his fleet spent traveling toward Charleston, Blackbeard noticed a serious problem, which was that he had way too many men now. With control over an estimated 400 men, Blackbeard would have to be constantly active to provide adequate provisions and pay to his crew. And it was noted that during this journey, numerous members of his crew had become very restless and irritable due to the increasingly cramped conditions in which they were forced to work. This was still the case even after two sloops were removed from the fleet in Nassau during the journey. But drunken, aggressive sailors were actually not Blackbeard's top concern. Instead, he was more focused on suppressing an illness that was running rampant through all of his ships. What this illness was is unknown, but it's quite likely that it was syphilis or some other type of venereal disease. So, medicine soon became his most sought after plunder. And while this is just speculative at best, it could be that Bonnet pointed Blackbeard towards Charleston as a worthy target. If you remember, early in his piratical adventures, Bonnet had performed essentially his own blockade of Charleston by stopping a couple of vessels sailing into the city. And, whether or not Bonnet influenced the decision or not, Blackbeard arrived in Charleston on May 22nd, 1718, all the same. Upon their arrival, Blackbeard had his four ships spread out across the Charleston bar so that any ship traveling in or out of the city could not pass without encountering a pirate ship. Over the following few days, the pirates would capture at least five ships without alerting the city. Two of the captured ships were leaving the city, while the three others were attempting to enter. Similar to Bonnet's strategy he had used the year prior, Blackbeard avoided alerting the city by preventing any ships he plundered from entering or returning to the city. But on day 4 or 5 of the blockade, a small fishing boat had spotted the pirates, and the port very quickly went into lockdown. Now, despite this, Charleston had no real way to retaliate against them, so the pirate ships continued to haunt the bar. Aboard the ships, Blackbeard had taken around 100 prisoners in total across all 5 ships he'd captured. The plan was Blackbeard planned to send a couple of his men into the city to deliver a message and a demand to Governor Johnson. The demand, which Blackbeard shared with the prisoners, was to turn over a few chests of medicine, or every prisoner aboard the ship would be killed and their heads would be delivered to the colony. Then, if the city still refused to accept the offer, the pirates said they would sail into the harbor, burn every ship, and destroy the entire city. But if the governor were to comply, Blackbeard claimed he would release the prisoners entirely unharmed. Among all of the prisoners Blackbeard had taken, there was one named Samuel Ragg. Ragg was a member of the Council of South Carolina and was aboard one of the outbound vessels when he was captured. Upon hearing Blackbeard's plan about his threat and demand, Ragg protested, saying the council would be a lot quicker to comply if the pirates were accompanied by one of the prisoners to, quote, truly represent the danger they were in. Well, it just so happened that Blackbeard agreed with this, and when he asked the prisoners who should be sent, Ragg volunteered himself. But Blackbeard, now knowing that Ragg was a member of South Carolina's council, Blackbeard saw him as far too valuable to just let go. So instead, Blackbeard chose a man who is just simply known as Mr. Marks to go in his place. Soon after, Mr. Marks Richards, who again was the current captain of the Revenge, and another pirate were sent off in a boat to deliver the message. Before they departed, though, Blackbeard told Marks and the other prisoners that if the men were not back in 24 hours, he would make good on all of his previous threats. Upon their arrival in the city, the three men gained an audience with Johnson, who, upon hearing the demands, quickly called for a council meeting to discuss what to do. During the meeting, every member of the council immediately agreed to the pirates' demands, knowing that they really had no alternative option. Now, when the medicine was delivered, Blackbeard made good on his deal and released every prisoner. But he didn't do so until he'd stripped nearly every valuable and piece of clothing from every single prisoner. Once that was done, the prisoners were loaded onto one of the captured vessels and sent on their way. The following day, Blackbeard and his vessels all sailed away from Charleston after terrorizing the city for nearly a week. After about another week of sailing, the pirates arrived near the Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina in the early days of June 1718. Once in the inlet, the pirates planned to take a short reprieve and repair all of their ships. But while all three sloops passed through the inlet without issue, the Queen Anne's Revenge struck a sandbar during her approach. Now, the ship hit this bar with so much force that its main mast immediately snapped. Additionally, the hull also sustained severe damage, and it very quickly began taking on water. Blackbeard then ordered the Adventure to sail close and to toss ropes to attempt to flee the larger ship. But just as the Adventure sailed near the Queen Anne's Revenge, it too struck a sandbar, which severely damaged it and again left that vessel grounded as well. Soon after, Blackbeard deemed both ships wrecked, and the treasures aboard them were moved to the Revenge and the other remaining sloop. Now, to this day, it's debated whether Blackbeard intentionally grounded these two vessels in order to split up his crew, which would also leave more treasure for himself and those he chose to keep in his company. But what Blackbeard does next makes it seem very likely that this was in some way planned. And it's in the aftermath of these wrecks where Bonnet reappears in the story. Now, despite being little more than a passenger or a prisoner, Bonnet had formed an unlikely friendship with Blackbeard. Because of this, Bonnet had confided in Blackbeard that he wished to pursue a pardon under the Act of Grace that was introduced in September 1717. The act would basically grant a pardon to pirates who surrendered before September 1718 for any crimes committed before January 1718. And shockingly to Bonnet, after the incident at Beaufort, Blackbeard told Bonnet that he wished to pursue a pardon as well. Now, while the time allotted meant they could still be tried for the Charleston Blockade and any other crimes they committed in 1718, both men knew that most colonial governors would waive the January deadline if it meant reducing the number of pirates. This was especially true of North Carolina's governor, Charles Eden, who was known for being very lenient towards pirates just in general. Still, Blackbeard wanted to play it safe, so he recommended that Bonnet travel to the capital city of Bath first to receive the pardon. To incentivize Bonnet to do this, Blackbeard relinquished the Revenge back to him as a sign of good faith. Immediately, Bonnet jumped at the offer, and he and a few of his men left for Bath on a small boat. Little did Bonnet know, however, that he had just played directly into Blackbeard's hands. After Bonnet departed, Blackbeard and his most trusted men transferred every piece of treasure from the Revenge onto the other sloop. Additionally, most provisions aboard the Revenge were moved to the other ship as well. Once this was done, the sloop, which Blackbeard renamed the Adventure, quickly and unceremoniously sailed away from the wrecks and the Revenge. Not only had Blackbeard betrayed Bonnet, but upon his departure, he had abandoned nearly 200 members of his former crew in the inlet. Similarly, aboard the Adventure, David Harriet, who was the captain of the original Adventure that Blackbeard had just destroyed, spoke up against the betrayal. In response, Blackbeard and his men marooned Harriet and 24 others who agreed with him on a remote island 3 miles from the Carolina shore. While all of this was happening, Bonnet had arrived in Bath and sought an audience with Governor Eden, who quickly pardoned him. As expected, the grace period deadline was also waived, meaning for all intents and purposes, Bonnet was once again a completely innocent man. With rumors that there was a new war on the horizon, Bonnet told Eden that he planned to sail back to the Caribbean to obtain a letter of marque, which would grant him the right to go privateering against Spanish ships. To further prove he'd truly be abandoning his life of piracy, Bonnet renamed the Revenge to the Royal James and requested clearance for his vessel from Eden. And what I mean by he requested clearance for a ship basically means the ship has the authority to be in the colony and also operate in the colony. Now, this would take a couple of weeks, but this request was eventually approved. Following this, Bonnet and the men who accompanied him began rowing back to their ship. Unbeknownst to them, shortly after their departure, Blackbeard sailed the Adventure into Bath and was quickly pardoned as well. When Bonnet finally made it back to the inlet and discovered he'd been betrayed, he was furious and wanted revenge. But with the Revenge, or now the Royal James, stripped to the bone, there was really nothing they could do at the moment. From the men Blackbeard had abandoned, Bonnet convinced about 20 of them to join his new crew, but a majority of those remaining pirates would travel to North Carolina and would eventually settle there and in the other colonies. With a now re-established crew, Bonnet set about resupplying the ship by hiring bumboats to ferry supplies. And bumboats are basically these little small boats that are used to transport items to ships that are anchored outside of a port. Now, a couple of days into the resupplying, Bonnet had heard of a group of marooned pirates on a nearby island. Figuring that those pirates that these bumboat guys were talking about had likely been abandoned by Blackbeard, Bonnet sailed to them where he found Harriet and his men and rescued them. And subsequently, all of them would actually end up joining Bonnet's new crew. Now, after about 2 weeks, the resupplying for the Royal James was nearly finished. But a captain aboard one of the bumboats told Bonnet that Blackbeard had been recently spotted on Ocracoke Island, and still furious about Blackbeard's treachery, Bonnet and the Royal James immediately left the inlet in pursuit of his former partner. But when they arrived at Ocracoke 4 days later, Blackbeard was nowhere to be found. And in fact, for the remainder of both of their lives, Bonnet and Blackbeard would never see each other again. With no knowledge of where Blackbeard could have possibly gone next, Bonnet got Bonnet gave up his desire for revenge. But in yet another moment that highlights Bonnet's inexperience, or idiocy, I guess, his blind rage fueled chase had expended much of the ship's newly stocked provisions. So, already in need of another restock, Bonnet set course for Chesapeake Bay once again. But on the journey there, Bonnet realized that they wouldn't make it to the bay before running out of supplies. Feeling that there was no other option, Bonnet, only a couple of weeks after being pardoned, returned to piracy. In early July, the Royal James and Bonnet, who was now using the pseudonym Thomas Richards, plundered a small vessel off of Cape Henry. From the vessel, the pirates took numerous barrels of pork and bread. But not wanting to appear as if they immediately violated their pardons, the pirates placed a few of their own barrels of rice on the other vessel to make it seem as if there had been a perfectly legal trade between the two ships. A couple of days later, the pirates captured a sloop carrying numerous barrels of rum and molasses, but instead of just taking the valuables, Bonnet actually wanted to turn this ship into a consort for the Royal James. So members of the ship that they had just captured, who showed a desire to join Bonnet's crew, along with a few men from the Royal James, were transferred over to the sloop. But just as all of the men got on board, they, quote, turned tail and immediately abandoned Bonnet. Now, according to most sources, this event is what finally and fully broke Bonnet. After having been removed as captain of his own vessel multiple times, being embarrassed in battle multiple times, being betrayed by Blackbeard, and now being fooled by members of his own crew, Bonnet was said to have, quote, thrown off all restraint, and he and his men were, quote, always ready for an engagement. And Bonnet's actions over the following couple of weeks would show this shift in behavior. For a while, the pirates kept up their trading facade, but eventually, around late July, they gave up this act and returned to just straight up piracy, and are said to have captured 13 ships in total throughout July 1718. From one of these ships, Bonnet came to employ a man named Robert Tucker. Soon after joining the Royal James, Bonnet instated Tucker as his quartermaster. But Tucker, unlike Bonnet, was said to be a man of violence and would often beat or cut captives. Also, Tucker was said to have more power on the Royal James than Bonnet, which we know was pretty common for him. On July 29th and July 31st, 1718, the Royal James captured the Fortune and Francis, respectively. Both ships, which were captured near the Delaware Bay, were converted into pirate vessels, bringing Bonnet's fleet to a total of 3. On August 1st, Bonnet had a handful of his crew ferry some prisoners from the vessels to the city of Lewes. Among those released were the wife and son of Thomas Reed, who was the captain of the Fortune. Before sending them off, Bonnet gave the boy a message to deliver, which is, quote, "If any of the inhabitants offered to hurt the hair of the head of any person belonging to him, he would put to death and destroy the prisoners he had on board, and would also go ashore and burn the whole town." Clearly, Bonnet had taken some inspiration from Blackbeard. Later that day, after the men returned unharmed, the Royal James, Fortune, and Francis sailed away from Delaware. After a month of action, the Royal James was steadily taking on water and was in desperate need of repairs. So, Bonnet charted a course for the Cape Fear River in North Carolina, which is the same location where he'd repaired the Revenge a year earlier. However, his second visit would end much differently than his first. On August 12th, 1718, all 3 vessels arrived and anchored in the Cape Fear River. Later that same day, a small ship entered the Cape River and was soon captured by the pirates. Afterward, it was entirely ripped up so its wood could be used to repair the Royal James. In addition to repairing his vessel, Bonnet had planned to remain in the river until mid October to avoid sailing during hurricane season, and for the next couple of weeks, nothing major really happened. But near the end of August, however, near the end of August, someone had spotted them, and word soon spread through the colonies that a pirate fleet was residing in Cape Fear. When the news reached Charleston, South Carolina, its residents panicked, fearing that another blockade might occur. But there was one South Carolinian who was determined to never let such an event happen again, and that man's name was Colonel William Rhett. Now, unlike Bonnet, Colonel Rhett was a true veteran, and he served during the War of Spanish Succession. Rhett was also known for being very courageous and was known to harbor a deep hatred of pirates, which was a sentiment that was only intensified by Blackbeard's actions a few months earlier. When he received word of the nearby pirates in Cape Fear, Colonel Rhett quickly went to Governor Johnson to request permission to lead an assault on them before they had the opportunity to attack Charleston again. Johnson, who we know was very present for the blockade, needed very little convincing and quickly approved the expedition. Within a week, Rhett had outfitted 2 sloops with 8 cannons each and had the combined force of 130 men. The ships, the Henry and the Sea Nymph, were captained by John Masters and Firer Hall, respectively. Then, on September 10th, Rhett, who was the overall commander of this operation, boarded the Henry and had the vessels sail to the nearby Sullivan's Island for final preparations. Later that day, however, a merchant vessel sailed nearby and informed the men that they had just been attacked by the notorious pirate Charles Vane. And unlike Bonnet and Blackbeard, who only used violence when necessary, Vane seemed to almost revel in violence, because those captured by Vane were often victims of torture and were brutally beaten. And because of this reputation, Vane was deemed the more pressing issue, and Rhett vowed to pursue him instead. When preparations were completed on September 15th, the Henry and Sea Nymph set sail from Sullivan's Island. Now, according to the men aboard the merchant vessel, Vane had said he planned to head south and find an inlet to repair his ship. Using that information, Rhett and his men spent the next week scouring nearly every inlet and river south of Charleston, but never came across Vane. Unbeknownst to all of them, Vane had already fled back to the Caribbean. So on September 20th, Rhett finally gave up the search and began sailing toward Cape Fear, where he arrived at the mouth of the river on the evening of September 26th. As they began to enter the river, the men spotted the masts of the Royal James and her 2 consorts, but before either of them could progress too far, both the Henry and the Sea Nymph ran aground in the narrow, shallow waters of the river. By the time the rising tide freed both ships, it was nearly midnight, and it was far too dark to launch their attack. So the men hunkered down and just stood guard. However, further upriver, a pirate lookout spotted the sloops as well. Afterward, Bonnet sent 3 of his men in canoes to investigate, hoping that the sloops would be easy prizes to claim. Unfortunately for him, his scouts returned with the news that the sloops were all very much armed and manned for war. So now realizing that they would be fighting their way out of the river the next morning, the pirates began preparing for battle. During these preparations, Bonnet drafted a letter to Governor Johnson. In the letter, which he showed to a South Carolinian prisoner aboard the Royal James, Bonnet stated that if he discovered that the ships had been, quote, sent by the honorable governor of South Carolina, he would then, quote, burn and destroy all ships or vessels going in or coming out of South Carolina. Then, at dawn the next morning, Bonnet's vessels swiftly made their way towards Rhett and his men. Bonnet's plan was to maneuver and fight his way past the 2 sloops and reach the ocean, where he was confident he could outrun them. Rhett, however, predicted this and positioned the Henry and the Sea Nymph in such a way that left very little room to escape the river. So, as the Royal James came within range of the Henry, both ships engaged one another. While trying to flank the Henry, the Royal James ran aground near the shore, as did the Francis and the Fortune. Luckily for Bonnet, however, during the Henry and the Sea Nymph's defensive maneuvers, they too had run aground. By the time every single ship was grounded, only the Royal James and the Henry were within range of one another. And in the way that the 2 ships were positioned, Bonnet actually had the advantage. When the Royal James became grounded, it tilted towards the shore and away from the Henry. On the other hand, when the Henry became grounded, it tilted towards the Royal James. That means that while the deck of the Royal James was mostly shielded from gunfire, the deck of the Henry was pretty much entirely exposed. And for the next 5 hours, the crews exchanged small arms fire. During the fighting, Bonnet paced the deck of the Royal James with a pistol in his hand, urging his men to keep fighting. In his bid to ward off the attackers, Bonnet forced prisoners aboard the Royal James to fight alongside the pirates and claimed that, quote, if anyone refused to fight, he would blow their brains out. And at one point, Bonnet nearly made good on this promise when one crewman who only wished to be a privateer told Bonnet he wouldn't fight. And just as Bonnet was about to pull the trigger, a man with whom Bonnet was said to be very close friends with was shot and killed nearby, which distracted him. While Bonnet was mourning, the tide freed the Henry from its position. And once the ship was afloat again, Rhett ordered it out to deeper water to make basic repairs before they would re engage. When that was done, the Henry sailed back to the still grounded Royal James. And believing that they would once again be thrust into battle, the men aboard the Henry were very surprised to see that upon their approach, the Royal James had raised a white flag of surrender. And for the third and final time, Stede Bonnet was defeated. Rhett's men soon took possession of the Royal James. Seeing as they had no actual knowledge of who they were fighting, Rhett and his men were said to be extremely well pleased to discover that they'd just defeated none other than Major Stede Bonnet, who had been known to be present at the Charleston Blockade. In total, 12 of Rhett's men were killed while 18 were injured. As for Bonnet's men, 9 of his men were killed and 3 were injured, and every still living pirate was captured. After spending the next 3 days recuperating, the Henry and the Sea Nymph departed from the Cape Fear River on September 30th, 1718. When Rhett returned to Charleston on October 3rd, 1718, every pirate except Bonnet was placed in the city's watch house, as Charleston actually had no public jail at the time. Bonnet, possibly because of his higher standing before his turned to piracy, was permitted to stay at the Charleston Marshal's house. A couple of days later, David Harriet and Ignatius Pell, who was the boatswain of the Royal James, were transferred to the Marshal's house as well. Now, those two had been granted permission to stay in the house because they had actually agreed to testify against their fellow pirates. But for the next 3 weeks, Charleston officials were harassed by several locals who were shockingly in support of Bonnet. What exactly this support stemmed from has pretty much been lost to history, but it is noted that, quote, people engaged in a violent protest in an effort to free the pirates, and on one occasion, quote, threatened to burn down the city if their demands were not met. Then, on October 24th, 1718, Bonnet and Harriet actually escaped from their makeshift jail. Now, how Bonnet and Harriet managed to do this has been heavily debated, because of course it is, but it's heavily debated because there were 2 guards stationed at the Marshal's house, and there was always someone there when the pirates were imprisoned there. Now, the most likely explanation is that the guards on the night of the escape had been bribed. This theory is strengthened by the fact that Bonnet and Harriet were said to escape in a canoe that belonged to a Robert Tuckerman. Tuckerman, who was a local mariner, was known for being empathetic towards pirates. Additionally, it's rumored that Tuckerman bribed the captain of the Sea Nymph, which was a ship that Tuckerman was a shareholder of. The theory is that he bribed the captain of the Sea Nymph to keep it away from the battle to prevent it from sustaining damage. Now, this obviously suggests that the ship's grounding may have been intentional to keep it away from battle, like I said. And we'll discuss Tuckerman here more in a minute. But following the discovery of Bonnet and Harriet's escape, Governor Johnson immediately put out a 700-pound bounty for Bonnet's capture. Additionally, Johnson dispatched numerous ships to the north and south to track down Bonnet, all of which actually returned empty-handed. And for 2 weeks, Bonnet and Harriet actually eluded capture. But in the early days of November 1718, someone reported seeing them along with an African American and a Native American on the northern side of Sullivan's Island. With that, Johnson once again called on Colonel Rhett to travel to the island and recapture the pirates. And when, on November 5th, 1718, Rhett and his men arrived at the rumored location, they did find Bonnet and Harriet's camp. Soon after the discovery, a brief firefight broke out, which resulted in the death of Harriet and the wounding of the African American and Native American men. Bonnet, however, was unscathed and captured once again. When Rhett searched Bonnet afterward, he discovered a letter Bonnet had pinned to Robert Tuckerman. It's from this letter that it was revealed that Tuckerman was indeed the man who had provided the canoe for the escape. Also, according to the letter, Tuckerman was meant to provide a sloop for Bonnet and Harriet so they could sail north into North Carolina, where they would seek the protection of Governor Eden. However, Tuckerman didn't make good on this promise, and it's likely because there was foul weather at the time. And later, Robert Tuckerman would be tried for assisting Bonnet's escape, but due to a lack of solid evidence, the case would end up being dropped. On November 6th, 1718, Rhett returned with Bonnet, who was then placed under stricter supervision as preparations for his trial continued. In the 2 weeks Bonnet was on the run, the crew of the Royal James was tried for piracy regarding the Fortune and Francis. All of them, totaling 33, pleaded not guilty. Of the very few who offered any sort of defense, they claimed that their turn to piracy after their pardon was out of necessity because they ran out of provisions after Bonnet pursued Blackbeard. However, due to the valuables found aboard the Royal James when she was captured and the testimony of Ignatius Pell, it was obvious to the court that Bonnet's men had willfully participated in piracy. When the trial concluded on November 5th, 1718, only 4 of the men were acquitted, while the remaining 29 were found guilty and sentenced to hang. Nicholas Trott, who was the presiding judge, set the execution date for November 8th, and it would proceed as scheduled. 2 days later, on November 10th, Bonnet would be brought to trial before Trott as well, and like his men, Bonnet pled not guilty to the taking of the Francis and Fortune, but unlike his men, Bonnet attempted to prove his innocence. In my use of the word attempted, you can probably guess how well this went. And it was through this trial that most information about Bonnet was discovered. Additionally, throughout this trial, his reckless and cocky attitude were very much on display. For example, when the original captain of the Francis was called to the stand, Bonnet, who was attempting to deny his involvement, asked whether the captain had personally heard Bonnet tell his men to plunder the Francis's valuables. In response, the captain said, quote, "I'm sorry you should ask me that question, for you know you did." Bonnet, now likely realizing he dug himself into yet another hole, fell silent after the captain's answer. Soon after, Bonnet would be found guilty of the capture of Francis. Following the verdict, Bonnet changed his plea in the taking of the fortune to guilty, even though it would change very little about the outcome. To that point, when Bonnet was found guilty of taking the fortune, Trott sentenced him to be hanged all the same. And after the ruling, Governor Johnson announced that Bonnet would be executed on December 10th. Throughout the remainder of November, public sympathy for Bonnet, especially among young women, swelled in Charleston, and many actually pleaded with Johnson to spare the gentleman pirate. Similarly, Bonnet, who was now trying anything to escape the gallows, had sent a letter to Johnson begging for mercy. In the letter, Bonnet begged Johnson to, quote, "as a Christian, have mercy and compassion on my miserable soul." Additionally, Bonnet offered to serve Johnson as a menial servant if it meant he would spare him. Johnson, however, denied any pleas for mercy. As his execution drew closer, Bonnet wrote another pleading note, but this time to Colonel Rhett. Surprisingly, though, Rhett actually did take pity on the gentleman pirate and, quote, offered to take him to England that his case might be laid directly to the king. Now, unsurprisingly, however, Johnson still remained steadfast in his decision. And during the final days of November 1718, it's very likely Bonnet heard tell of the slaying of Blackbeard at the hands of a Virginia military group. And while unlikely, it could be possible that Bonnet took comfort in the fact that he outlived Blackbeard, who was a man that whose whose betrayal played a small role in Bonnet's demise. Finally, on December 10th, 1718, Major Stede Bonnet was transported to White Point to be hanged. During his walk to the gallows, Bonnet was said to be in either a state of shock or delirium. Whatever the case, a noose was placed around his neck, and a few moments later, Bonnet, holding a bouquet in his hands, was hanged until death. Afterward, Stede Bonnet's body would be cut down and buried alongside the crew in a nearby swamp, and despite how many times his gentleman nature had afforded him better treatment, Bonnet's grave would remain unmarked, just as his men's. And that is the end of our coverage of the gentleman pirate Major Stede Bonnet. Now, unlike Blackbeard, there isn't really much to cover about Bonnet after his death. Whereas Blackbeard's ship and possibly his skull have been recovered, nothing physically remains of Stede Bonnet. The only thing worth noting, really, is that at White Point there is a historical marker that notes how Bonnet and his crew were hanged there. As for my personal thoughts about Bonnet, I do have a few things I want to mention. The biggest thing I want to say is that obviously, if you've played the game, Stede Bonnet's life and personality differ quite a bit from his Black Flag counterpart. While definitely still naive, the the Bonnet of real history was far more spiteful and crass than the happy-go-lucky Bonnet of the game. Despite these differences, I still find Bonnet's accompaniment with Blackbeard hilarious both in real life and in the game, while his golden retriever-esque energy in the game makes the pairing exaggeratedly unbelievable. The real life Bonnet's pairing with Blackbeard is also pretty hard to fathom. On this one ship, you have this man who crippled an entire city for a week, terrified every colony, and is still talked about to this day. But also on that same ship, there is a man who left a life of wealth to become a pirate, who was not particularly very good at it, and all around seemed to have very little idea what he was doing. It's just one of the weirdest real life pairings I've ever heard of. I don't really think I actually have that much more to say about the story. As for the work that went into this, I know I say this in about every video these days, but it ended up taking a lot longer than I expected. I actually originally wanted to get this out before Black Flag resynced, but per usual, I ran out of time. And I think I underestimated it because going into this, I kind of expected most of Bonnet's life to just kind of be a side note compared to the more successful pirates he was often surrounded by. But it seems just because of the sheer fact that he was around Blackbeard, it seemed to make Bonnet just notable for that reason. And speaking of Blackbeard, I I worried multiple times throughout this, and I know I've mentioned him a lot in this. I was worried that he was kind of going to take over this whole story. Um, and while that would be a very Blackbeard thing to do, I think I figured out a good way to balance everything out. At least I hope so. I know I mentioned it earlier, but I was trying to present this video. Well, hold on, let me figure out how I want to word this. Trying to frame this video only through Bonnet's perspective would have been extremely hard to do. And like I said, with the Charleston blockade, there's so many events that Bonnet just happened to be around that it's you can't really just gloss over them. I think that's really all I have to say. As for what's coming next, I really have no idea. I obviously have a few ideas rolling around. It's just about figuring out which one I actually want to commit to. Whatever it ends up being, you all know that I'll keep you updated about any progress or issues I encounter while working on it. With that said, if you made it this far into the video and enjoyed it, all I ask is that you consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Those are the two best ways to support me, and they show me that you all enjoy what I'm doing here. And as always, I want to thank you all for watching. Thank you all for your continued patience. Um, Thank you for just listening to me yap about things. And as always, I hope to see you all again very soon.